Okay. So in the remainder of this session, I'm just going to show you some Svelte code, and I'm going to try to explain how everything fits together. If some things are not clear, you can just ask me. So I'm not going to live code this like I did in the previous sessions. The code is already there, and I'm just going to try to explain how it is structured and what everything in the code is doing. So I'm going to do that directly on the Svelte website, and the Svelte website has this really nice interactive program module. It's called the REPL. And so you can write your code and you can see the output on the right, a bit similar to what we have been doing in the previous session. And it's really nice to just get up and running with Svelte. There's also an interactive tutorial that is also a bit doing it in the same way, like you have to do little exercises and you can see the output. So that's really helpful for learning Svelte, and that's also how I learned it. So let's use this format. You can see the chart that we built the last two sessions, but only in D3, and of course now it is built in Svelte. So the interface that you see here is that you have these different tabs. Those are different files. So this is the file containing the data. It's the same data that we have been using in the previous sessions. So you have for each country the name, the population 1960, population in 2018, I think it is, life expectancy in 1960, life expectancy in 2018, GDP 1960, GDP 2018, and then also the continent. So it's using the same data, and the main file is this file called app.svelte, and this is actually importing the three other files that we have here. And just to show you the basic structure of this file, I first have a script tag where I put in all the JavaScript. And after that, I'm just writing HTML. So you can see here, for example, those two inputs, those are the radio buttons here. So first a part JavaScript, then a part HTML. And if you like, you can also add styling. So directly write the CSS also in the same file. And this reflects the componentization that Svelte is using. So if you write a component, you can write a JavaScript with all the logic. You have the HTML that is returned, and then you also have the styling. So every component is really on its own. It has its own styling and its own logic and its own HTML that it returns. So this can really help you in write clear code and in clear structure of the app, or in this case, the visualization that you're building. I'm going to first show you a little bit of the HTML. So here, this last block here is the block that is generating or adding the bubbles to the visualization. And you can see here the special syntax here that Svelte has. This line over here is what you use to iterate over arrays of data and return something for each item in the array. So don't worry too much about the tweened points. Tweened points is just an array of data that we loop over. And what we are returning is a bubble, and the bubble has these four properties: the exposition Y, the radius, and the fill. And this bubble is actually imported as a separate component all the way in the beginning of the file. So here I'm importing the bubble component from the bubble.svelte file. So let's check out how that looks like. And it's the most basic component. So again, we have a little bit of JavaScript here in the beginning. We're exporting 4 variables, the CX, CY, R, and fill. And that is actually how you in Svelte write what properties this component is expected to receive from its parent component. So those are exactly the same things that we are adding here as properties to the bubble components. So this is the JavaScript. It's actually doing not much. It's just receiving the properties from the parent. And here, this is the HTML, also really simple. It's just a bit of an SVG circle that has these 4 properties. And if you write CX like that in curly brackets, it's actually the same thing as writing CX equals CX in curly brackets. And so what is happening is that the component is receiving the property from the parent component, and this component then adds the property to the SVG circle over here. And then here we have a little style block that says that the circle should have a black stroke. And the nice thing about Svelte is that this styling is scoped, which means that it only applies to the circles in this component. If you have a page where you have multiple visualizations that are also using circles, this CSS here, this styling will not apply to the circles that you have in other visualizations, because this styling is scoped to this component. It will only apply to the circles in this component. So that's the basic logic of components in Svelte. You separate all the logic and the styling to be contained in a separate component, and then you can import the components and do things like iterate over data and return a bubble, which is in fact a circle for each of the elements in the data. Of course, once you have the bubble component, you can have other charts importing the bubbles, as long as the parent or that visualization that's importing the bubble is also providing these properties to these bubbles. The visualization can perfectly use the same component. So that's the nice thing about components. You can reuse them in different parts of your application. So I hope that is quite clear. That this is I think the main thing about these components, that you can reuse them and that they are scoped, that they stand on their own, and that they don't interfere with other components. So I think with that in place, we can go through the code just step by step. And as said, you can always stop me if I go too fast, or if this is not, if there's something that's not clear. So the first thing we do is we import some modules from Svelte itself. The first one is the tweened one. This is going to help us interpolate. Maybe I can show you first what is happening when I click the radio buttons. When I click the radio buttons, you can see that the circles move, but if you watch the axis, you can also see that they are animated too. They adjust to the range of the values in the data, so they are also actually interpolated. In Svelte, you interpolate things with tweened, and I'll show you how that goes in a minute. When you tween things, you have usually a parameter that you can set that determines how things are tweened, or the interpolations linear, for example, or do they take another shape? Do they speed up in the beginning fast and then slow down at the end? So this is called easing, and Svelte has these built into. Then we have just the import of the data. We import it as a variable called data. And within this environment, this REPL on the Svelte website, D3 is already installed. So you can just import different functions that you need from D3 within this environment. You don't have to install D3, it's already there. So I'm importing here mainly all these scales to calculate the position and size, and also the color of these bubbles. And then I'm importing two components that I have written here myself. So the first one is the bubble component, which we looked at. The second one is the grid component, but we can have a look at that one when we get to the part where they are added to the visualization. Then first, what we need to set up is the structure for the data for the interpolation or for the animation. So I'm declaring a variable here, 2018. And if I go down the HTML and I look at the radio buttons, you can see that this variable appears here as well. And I'm using the bind directive here of Svelte, which means that this radio button is now tied to the year variable. And I'm grouping those two radio buttons with group. So Svelte knows that these radio buttons are tied to the year variable that I have in my JavaScript. And whenever I change the radio button value, the variable will update. If you think back to last session, we also had the radio buttons, but we had to manually add a listener to the radio buttons to be able to catch the change in the radio buttons. We don't have to do that here because Svelte is doing that for us. We can just bind a variable to an input element, and they will listen to each other. So when you change the variable, the input will change, or when you change the input, the variable will change. Then we do a little bit of data preparation here. In the data, we have all the numbers for a single country grouped into one object. What we actually need is we have to separate the values for 1960 and the values for 2018. So we can provide them to Svelte, and so that Svelte can interpolate between those values. So that's this part here. I'm just calculating two new variables, two new arrays, data 60 and data 18, and they just contain the same property names. So we have the country, the continent, population, life expectancy, and income. But over here, I'm setting them to the 1960 values, and over here, they are set to the 2018 value. So the structure of these two arrays and the objects they contain, they are completely the same. The only thing that's different is the value. So when I have those two arrays and structure in the same format, I can let Svelte interpolate between the values. And that's actually the next thing here. I'm declaring a new variable called tween points. And this is using the tweened that I imported in the first line of this application. And I set the initial value to data 18. So the values that you see initially are the values for 2018. And I specify some other things like the delay, and the delay is 0, which means that when things change, they are immediately started, the interpolation starts immediately. The interpolation should take a duration of 1,500 milliseconds, so 1.5 seconds. And I'm choosing an easing method here as well. So now tween points is set to 2018. What of course should happen when the radio buttons change is that tween points should take the value of the, or the data should be the values of 1960. So that is what I'm doing here. And this is also something that's really important, or really important to understand, is the syntax here with the $sign. So $sign and then double point here means that everything that follows is reactive. And that means that everything after that, Svelte will look at variables in this piece of code, in this snippet of code. And whenever it sees a variable, it knows that whenever that variable changes, it has to reevaluate or run this snippet because it's reactive. It reacts to changes in the other variables. So what I'm saying here is that whenever year is changing, Svelte should check if year is equal to 1960, and when it is, tween points should be set to the data from 1960. If year is not equal to 1960, it can only be 2018 because we only have 2 radio buttons. Then tween points should be set to the values of 2018. And the reactivity is quite important here because when you have just regular JavaScript, it will be executed once. And you can react to changes, but then you have to write your own logic to do so. And with this simple syntax, it's quite easy to have variables that depend on other variables. And this is just going, yeah, it's going automatically. You don't have to worry about how things are dependent on each other. You just declare it with a $sign, and you know that when year updates, this this piece of code will also be run, and you can update tween points. We'll see some more reactivity later on. The next part is pretty straightforward. This is just some variables that I set up for the visualization. So we have the margins and the width and the height of the visualization. Just like what we did with D3, we are defining an inner height here so that we have, or that we exclude the margins from the height. So the inner height is the actual height that we're going to work with to calculate the scales. And I'm defining another variable here also, the maximum population, and I defining it here as the population of the biggest country, or the population of the country with the highest population in 2018. This is also a constant, which means that when I switch to 1960, I'm still using the same scale for the radius as in 2018. So you can see that the circles get smaller just because their population is smaller. Then in the next part, declaring the scales here, the X and Y scales. And you can see that I'm also using the reactive or the syntax for reactive values, which means that the scales are recalculated whenever one of the variables that I use here changes. And you can see here that I'm using the tween points, which is the variable that contains the data that the chart should show. So either the data from 2018 or the data from 1916. So whenever that changes, the domain of the scale also changes. And you can see that quite clearly, especially on the Y scale. So in 2080, the ticks go from 55 up to 80. If I go to 1960, you can see that now the lowest value here is 35 and the highest value is 70. So depending on the data that the chart is showing, the X and Y scale also adjusts. Of course, this is something that you might not always want. If you remember the visualization that we made in D3, it had a fixed X and Y scale. And we can also do that. I provided here a way of doing that by adding some commented lines, so I can uncomment them and then comment the other line here, do the same thing for the Y scale. So now I'm fixing the domain. So the X scale now goes from 400 to 70,000 and the Y scale from 30 to 90, and this is fixed. When I change the values here, you can see that the X's don't change anymore because they are not responding to the between points variable because these lines are now commented out. The only other variable here in this reactive statement here for the X scale is the inner width. And whenever the inner width is not changing, it doesn't make sense anymore to make this reactive. Then I can just say const, and it will be the same thing. This code will now only run once, and Svelte will know, okay, the X scale is a logarithmic scale coming from D3, but it's not reactive, so I don't have to keep track of what other variables it depends on because it's not reactive anymore. It might make sense to still make this reactive like this, if you know that inner width can change, and this can happen, for example, when people resize their browser window, then inner width might change if you have a responsive visualization. So for making visualizations responsive, this reactivity can also be quite handy. Then I have some other variables here, reactive variables. These are the ticks for both the X and Y scales over here. And these are things that I'm going to use to generate the grid. And I'll show you that in a minute. But just remember that the ticks are reactive, so they react to changes in the X scale, and X scale is reactive because it reacts to changes in between points. Let me just change it again to how it was. And then I can show you what I mean. If you look at the values on the Y-axis, for example, if I change the year, I change the data, and I also change the ticks. You can see that halfway through the animation, there are some other ticks there. They are coming from D3 with the ticks method here of the X scale. I'm getting the ticks that D3 automatically adds to the scale. So I can draw the grid here and these little labels here on the axis as well. Then some more scales here, but nothing new here. This is the same as what we did with D3, just a square root scale for the radius of the circles and a color scale that maps the colors to the continents. This is identical to what we did in D3. Then this is all the JavaScript for this visualization. And so here the HTML starts. And we've already looked at the inputs here, the radio buttons, which are bound to the year variable in the JavaScript. And then from here on, we'll start with the SVG. So here we have an SVG with a width and a height property, and just like in the bubble component, including a variable in curly brackets is the same as saying the width equals that variable. So here we have a width property that's equal to the width variable in the JavaScript, and the same thing for the height. This is also similar to what we did with D3. So we're adding a group and we're shifting it a little bit to create some margins on the left and on the top. And this is the main group that we are going to add all our bubbles and also the grid So it's the main container for the visual elements on the chart. Then we're almost there. Let's take a look at this grid component. We have two grid components added here, and it takes 5 properties, the grid component. So we have a grid type, which can be either an X grid or a Y grid. I provide also the inner height and the inner width of the chart. And then for each of these grids, I provide the X scale or Y scale. And then finally, also the ticks of those scales. So these are the reactive ticks that I declared a little in the JavaScript, and I'm also passing those to the grid components. Now let's take a look at the internals of the grid component. I'm importing something here from D3 that's for formatting the labels on the X scale. But the main thing here are these 5 exported variables. And as said, this is the way you tell Svelte what the properties are going to be that this component is going to receive. So those are the same ones as, I'm sorry, it jumps to the beginning. So these 5 properties are the same ones as these 5 ones. So we have 2 types of grids. We have a grid for X and a grid for Y. And depending on what grid type is received through the properties, this component needs to return different things. So whenever a grid is an X grid, we draw the lines in the those are the vertical lines, so the vertical grid, the grid for the X scale. So here I say if grid type equals X grid, then for each of the ticks, for each of these numbers, return a line. A line is also an SVG element. It has an X1 and an X2. I'm setting it to the values of the tick, but transformed through the scale, which in this case is the X scale. And then also the I1 and Y2 properties. So you'll have a line that goes from the top to the bottom of the chart. And I'm also assigning a class of grid line, which is referenced here in the styling. So here I'm having some styling. Here I'm saying it should be a dashed line in gray, 1 pixel wide. So that is done through CSS. So those are the lines. Then we also have the text, which are these little labels here at the bottom. They should be placed on their X position. So again, the value of the tick, but transformed through the scale. And I'm saying that their Y position should be equal to inner height plus 20. So the height of the chart plus a little more to prevent them being on top of the grid lines. And I'm assigning a class here of tick label, which again is referenced here in the CSS. So it's an 11 pixel font size and a fill in a gray fill. And then finally, the value in that text element should be the value of the tick, but formatted with the format function of D3. So this is telling D3 that it should format the value with 1 significant number and in the way that you add a K for 1,000 and an M for million. So this is just a way how you specify a certain format in D3. Then for the Y grid is basically the same, but of course you have different values for the X1 and X2 for the lines, because now you want horizontal lines. And here I'm not formatting the values of the labels because they can just be as they are. They are not in the thousands or millions, so I can just use their value to put in the text elements. So that's the grid component, which returns either horizontal lines or vertical lines, depending on the ticks of the D3 scales. And so in the code, I'm adding them before the bubbles, so that the bubbles are drawn on top of the grid. If I would move this piece of code below this block here, the lines would run over the bubbles, but that would be visually not so pleasing. So the only thing left here are those two text elements, which are the labels or the titles of the axis. So this is the life expectancy you see here, and the GDP per capita over there. This is just basic SVG, nothing to do with Svelte. And then finally, we end up with the bubbles, which we have already discussed. So you have a bubble for each element in the tween points array, and you're using the bubble components and its properties to add them to the chart. So I think with that, we went through the whole code. Maybe a quick recap. We have one main component, the app.svelte component, which has JavaScript and HTML. It's importing things from Svelte. It's importing the data. It's importing things from D3 that we use to calculate the visual properties of the elements on the chart. And then we have two custom components that we import. We have the year variable, which is bound to the radio buttons over here, so that we can change the variable by clicking on the radio buttons. We have two arrays containing the data, one from 1960 and one for 2018, and we need those to be able to use the tweened that we imported from Svelte. So that's what we're doing here. We are defining tween points as a tweened, and we're setting its initial value to the ones from 2018. And then here, with this reactive statement, we change the value of tween points by setting it to the data from 1960 whenever the year variable changes. So here we're using the reactivity of Svelte. This is basic setup. In this case, we are defining reactive scales for X and Y, and also defining the reactive values of the ticks. And I actually realize now that because we are passing the scales to the grid component, what we could do is just in the grid component, instead of having this separate ticks property, we could just take the ticks property from this property over here. So it's a bit double what we're doing there with the grid. We're passing it the scales and also the ticks, but actually the ticks are a property or inherent to the scale, so we shouldn't pass the scale and tick separately. They are already in the scale. But yeah, that's a minor detail here. That was everything for the JavaScript. We have here the HTML with the radio buttons bound to the year variable, the SVG with its width and height, the grid components for X and Y to draw these vertical and horizontal lines, and then finally a little each block to iterate over tween points and add the bubbles to the chart. I hope that didn't go too fast and that you were able to follow along. Some things were common to what we saw in the previous two sessions, so they should be familiar. But of course, with Svelte, a lot of new things are added as well. But I think we still have some time for questions. So if anything was not clear, please just ask me now.